The US economy, for the moment, did manage to accelerate in the first quarter of the year, as you can see on the chart behind me. In fact, it grew by 2.5% in the first 3 months of the year. That's quite a bit better, as you can see there, than most of the recent quarters. But what we were expecting was something quite a bit closer to the coveted 3%, not 2.5% over there at the end of the chart. Austerity measures are partly to blame for this. Forced spending cuts came into effect in March, and the lack of government spending offset some of the gains that were made in other areas. Robert Shapiro was the US Undersecretary of Commerce under President Clinton. He's now the chairman of Sonecon, and he joins us now live from CNN Washington to put these figures into perspective. So, Robert, what's your first reaction to this GDP number? It's not all that bad if you're sitting where I am.
Yes, well, it certainly looks good from a European perspective. What it seems to indicate is that the economic process is doing quite fine. The problem is the political process. And we see that in two regards. First of all, consumer spending not only was pretty strong, but it really has accelerated relative to all of 2012. Business investment was strong, but that's a little less certain because a lot of that was inventory buildup. The real negatives in this report were, as you mentioned, government spending because of the nitwit sequester policy, and U.S. exports. And trade was also a negative, and that reflects EU nitwit austerity policy. So I think if we could take the ill-advised political element, which has been driving towards austerity in the face of fairly weak economies, and just let the economy recover on its own with support from monetary policy, I think we would have hit that 3%.
Well, as you mentioned, we had things like the sequester going on over the last quarter. Would you have expected that to have had more of an impact on these figures?
Well, the reason we don't see more of an impact is that we saw an even larger impact in the fourth quarter of 2012. And so this is building off of that. And in fact, the damage to growth from the reduction in government spending was less great in the first quarter of this year than it was in the last quarter of last year. So even though it was a negative, it was a smaller negative than it had been in the previous quarter. Yeah. And so that's why you see less of a negative. And it would have to, the spending cuts would have had to have accelerated to get a larger effect. And it came off the back of a more difficult comparison for the last quarter. If we take a look at the consumer spending figures here, though, contained inside this GDP report released just hours ago, that is a particular bright spot because the consumer accounts for about 2/3 of the US's economic makeup, and those consumer spending figures came in the strongest since 2010. Yes, and this has been a trend we've been seeing over the last year, and what it really reflects is the end of the deleveraging process. That is, the financial crisis and the deep recession increased people's debts, particularly relative to their assets. The same thing was happening to business. And among consumers, what you saw was a significant slowdown in spending so that people could use their incomes to reduce their debt levels. Well, actually, by the beginning of 2012, the household debt levels had essentially returned to normal levels. They had worked off the premium from the crisis. And so this is, for people who follow those kinds of pieces of data, this has been expected. Just ever so briefly, Robert, having been in government yourself, responsible for economic policy for the United States, how should the current administration translate these kind of GDP figures into real growth in terms of jobs? Well, I think there are a couple things. One is, I think the jobs problem is not only a problem of this cycle, this weak recovery, it's also a structural problem because we saw even greater job creation problems actually in the Bush expansion. So I think what we need to do is we need to put in place a set of policies that'll make it cheaper for business to create new jobs. I think now's the time to think about permanent reductions in the employer side of the payroll tax, for example. I think that would help. Apart from these employment-targeted policies, the most important thing is to not weaken the economy by continuing with misguided short-term austerity measures. Yes, we have to reform our tax system to increase broaden the tax base. We have to reform our Social Security and particularly our Medicare and Medicaid systems. But those are really longer-term, medium and long-term problems. For the short term, what we need to do is support this economy.
Okay, Robert Shapiro there. Thanks ever so much.